At the Christmas table, my sister looked at a 7-year-old girl and said, "She doesn't belong here." Those 4 words hit me like a slap across the face. The whole room went dead silent. Forks stopped moving. My mother froze mid-sip, her wine glass still pressed against her lips. And Lily, the little girl I'd brought into my life just 3 months earlier, sat perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes locked on her plate like she was trying to disappear. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just sat there, absorbing every bit of that cruelty like she'd been trained to take it. And that silence, that awful, suffocating silence, was what broke me. Because nobody at that table said a word. Not my mother. Not my father. Not even my husband. Rachel smiled, like she'd just said something everyone was already thinking. Then, in the smallest voice I've ever heard, Lily whispered, "I'm sorry," she apologized. A 7-year-old girl apologized for existing. In that moment, something inside me cracked wide open. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. My hands were shaking, my chest was tight. And for the first time in my entire life, I looked my sister dead in the eyes and said, "If she doesn't belong here, then neither do I." At that moment, I didn't know that everything started 3 months earlier, with a phone call I almost ignored. "Hi everyone, my name is Emma. I'm 34 years old, and this story started on a rainy night in October when my phone rang at 2:30 inches the morning. Now, if you're an ER nurse like me, late-night calls aren't exactly unusual. I've been working the emergency room at Seattle General for almost 8 years. I've seen car accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, you name it. So when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, my first instinct was to grab it and check if the hospital needed me for an extra shift. But the number on the screen wasn't the hospital. It was a number I didn't recognize, with an area code from Portland. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was exhausted. I'd just finished a 12-hour shift. My feet were killing me, and Daniel, my husband, was snoring next to me like the world was perfectly fine. And honestly, at that point, our world was anything but fine. We'd been trying to have a baby for over 2 years. 2 rounds of IVF, 3 miscarriages, thousands of dollars gone. And with every failed attempt, the distance between us grew a little wider. We stopped talking about it. We stopped talking about a lot of things. The silence in our house had become so thick you could almost touch it. So that night, when I picked up the phone, I wasn't expecting much. A wrong number, maybe. A scam call. Anything but what actually came next. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost robotic. She introduced herself as a caseworker from Child Protective Services in Portland, Oregon. She said she was calling about a child, a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who had been placed in emergency foster care after her mother passed away from a drug overdose. And then she said the words that knocked the air right out of my lungs. She told me that according to the mother's records, I was listed as the biological father's former partner, and there was reason to believe this child could be mine. My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed so fast that Daniel stirred beside me, mumbling something incoherent before rolling over. My mind was racing. A child. My child. From a relationship I buried so deep I almost forgot it existed. I whispered into the phone, asking if she was sure, if there had been some kind of mistake. But deep down, when she said the mother's name, Megan Holt, I already knew. I already knew this was real. 3 hours later, I stood outside a government building, about to meet a child who could change my life forever. She was sitting alone in a plastic chair, holding a stuffed bear like it was the only thing keeping her together. That's the first thing I saw when I walked through the doors of the Child Protective Services office that morning. The hallway smelled like cheap cleaning products and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a yellowish glow that made everything feel cold and institutional. And there, at the end of a long corridor, was a little girl in a faded pink hoodie, 2 sizes too big for her. Her legs dangling off the chair because her feet couldn't reach the floor. She wasn't crying. She wasn't fidgeting. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, like she'd learned a long time ago that being quiet meant being safe. The stuffed bear in her arms was missing one eye and had a rip along its belly that someone had tried to fix with tape. She held it pressed against her chest, both arms wrapped around it tight, like if she let go, she'd fall apart too. A caseworker named Sandra met me at the front desk. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a stack of folders under her arm. She shook my hand firmly and led me to a small conference room down the hall. Before we went in, she paused and looked at me with the kind of expression that told me she'd done this 1,000 times before but never got used to it. She lowered her voice and told me she needed to prepare me before I met Lily. She said the girl had been through a lot. Sandra opened one of the folders and started going through the details. Lily had been living with her mother, Megan, in a one-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland. Megan had struggled with addiction for years, in and out of rehab, in and out of relationships, each one worse than the last. Lily had been exposed to things no child should ever see. There were reports of neglect, periods where the power was shut off, neighbors who called the police when they heard screaming, and through all of it, Lily never said a word. Not to teachers, not to social workers, not to anyone. Sandra slid a photograph across the table. It was Lily's school picture from the previous year. A small face with big brown eyes staring into the camera with no smile, no expression at all, just a blank, hollow look that made my stomach turn. Then Sandra pulled out something else. A letter. She said they found it in Megan's apartment after she died, tucked inside an envelope with my name on it. My hands were trembling when I took it. The handwriting was messy, uneven, like it was written in a hurry or maybe with shaking hands. Megan wrote that she was sorry. She said she never told me about Lily because she was scared I'd take her away. She said she tried to be a good mother but knew she was failing. And at the end, in letters pressed so hard the pen almost tore through the paper, she wrote, "Please don't let her end up like me." I sat there for a long time after reading that letter. The words blurred in front of my eyes because I was crying and I didn't even realize it. Sandra gave me a moment, then gently asked if I was ready to meet her. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, took a deep breath, and nodded. When I walked into that hallway again, Lily was exactly where I'd left her. She hadn't moved an inch. Sandra knelt down beside her and spoke softly, telling her that someone was here to see her. Lily looked up, and for the first time, our eyes met. She didn't smile. She didn't say hello. She just stared at me with those big brown eyes, scanning my face like she was trying to figure out if I was safe or dangerous. I knelt down, so I was at her level. I told her my name was Emma, and that I was there to help her. She didn't respond. She just pulled her bear closer to her chest and looked back down at the floor. But then, after what felt like an eternity, she did something that shattered me completely. She reached out with one small hand, barely extending it past the bear, and touched my wrist. Not a grab, not a hold, just a touch, light as a feather, like she was testing whether I was real. And in that moment, I didn't need a DNA test. I didn't need paperwork or court orders or anyone's permission. I looked at that little girl, broken and silent and holding onto a one-eyed bear with tape on its belly, and I knew she was mine. Not by blood, not by law, but by something deeper than both. I turned to Sandra with tears still running down my face and told her I was taking her home. But bringing her home was the easiest part. Explaining it to my husband was where everything started to fall apart. My husband stared at the child, then at me, like I had just destroyed our entire future. It was almost noon when I pulled into our driveway with Lily in the back seat. She'd fallen asleep during the 3-hour drive from Portland, her head tilted against the window, the stuffed bear still locked in her arms. I sat in the car for a few minutes after I parked, watching her sleep, trying to figure out how I was going to walk through that front door and explain this to Daniel. Our house was a small 2-story in Ballard, a quiet neighborhood in North Seattle. We bought it 4 years ago when things were still good between us. back when we used to talk about filling the empty rooms with kids and laughter. Now those rooms were just empty. I carried Lily inside and set her down on the couch in the living room. She stirred a little but didn't wake up. I covered her with a blanket and stood there watching her for a moment. This tiny person curled up in my house like a stray cat that wandered in from the rain. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee. He hadn't heard us come in because he had his headphones on, listening to some podcast about stock markets or crypto or whatever he was into that month. When I walked in, he pulled one earbud out and gave me that look, the one he always gave me when I came home from a shift looking wrecked. He asked me if I was okay, said I looked like I'd been crying. I told him to sit down. He didn't like that. Nobody likes hearing sit down because it never comes before good news. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and waited. I started from the beginning. The phone call, CPS, Megan, the letter. And with every sentence, I watched his face change. First confusion, then disbelief, then something harder, something colder that I'd never seen in his eyes before. When I finished talking, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the coffee maker dripping. Daniel didn't move for a long time. He just stood there, staring at me like I was a stranger who had broken into his house. Then, in a voice so controlled it scared me, he asked me where the child was right now. I told him she was asleep on the couch. His jaw tightened. He set his coffee mug down on the counter slowly, deliberately, like he was afraid if he moved too fast he might throw it. He walked past me without a word, went to the living room doorway, and looked at Lily sleeping on our couch. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds. Then he came back, sat down at the kitchen table, put his hands flat on the surface, and said, "You need to explain to me how you have a 7-year-old child that I never knew about." So I did. I told him everything. About Megan. About the relationship I had with her 8 years ago, before Daniel and I even met. It was brief, messy, and ended badly. Megan was already using back then, and I walked away before things got worse. I never knew she was pregnant. I never heard from her again. Daniel listened without interrupting, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. When I was done, he looked at me with eyes that were red around the edges and asked me one question. He asked me why I never told him about Megan. Not about the child. He understood I didn't know about that. But about Megan herself, about that whole part of my past. And he was right. I had never mentioned her, not once in 6 years of marriage. I buried that chapter of my life so deep that I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore. But sitting across from my husband in that kitchen, watching the trust drain from his face like water through a cracked glass, I realized that secrets don't disappear just because you stop thinking about them. They wait, and they always come back at the worst possible time. The next few days were brutal. Daniel barely spoke to me. He slept in the guest room. He'd come home from work, glance at Lily like she was a piece of furniture that didn't belong, and disappear upstairs. Lily noticed. Kids always notice. She started apologizing for everything. Sorry for making noise. Sorry for sitting in the wrong chair. Sorry for breathing too loud. Every sorry that came out of her mouth was a knife in my chest. One night, about a week after I brought Lily home, Daniel came downstairs after she was asleep. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd first told him everything. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his hair uncombed. He told me he'd been thinking a lot, and that he needed to be honest with me. He said he couldn't do this. He said he'd spent 2 years watching me go through IVF, holding my hand through miscarriages, grieving the children we couldn't have. And now I was asking him to raise someone else's child. A child that came from a past I hid from him. He said it wasn't about Lily. He said it was about trust, about the fact that I made the biggest decision of our lives without even asking him. I tried to explain. I told him I didn't plan any of this, that I couldn't just leave her in the system, that she had nowhere else to go. But Daniel shook his head slowly and said something that cut deeper than anything Rachel would later say at Christmas. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice cracking just slightly, and told me that I chose a stranger over my own husband. Then he stood up, went upstairs, packed a bag, and left. I heard the front door close. I heard his car start. I heard the tires on the wet pavement as he pulled out of the driveway. And then silence. Just me, alone in that kitchen, with a sleeping child upstairs who had no idea that her arrival had just ended my marriage. I thought losing my husband was the worst part. Until I told my family. My sister didn't even let me finish before she said, "That's not your problem." I called Rachel 2 days after Daniel left. I don't know why I called her first instead of my mom. Maybe because Rachel was the older sister, the one who always had answers, the one who organized family dinners and managed everyone's expectations like a project manager running a board meeting. She was 38, married to a successful real estate developer named Greg, and had 2 perfect children, a boy and a girl, both in private school, both in travel soccer, both exactly the kind of kids you put on a Christmas card. Rachel's life was a highlight reel, and she made sure everyone knew it. So when I called her that Tuesday morning, I was hoping for something. Not sympathy exactly, but maybe understanding. Maybe a moment of sisterly compassion where she'd say, "That's a lot, Emma, but we'll figure it out." Instead, the second I mentioned a child from a past relationship, Rachel cut me off mid-sentence. Her voice shifted from casual to cold in under a second. She told me I couldn't be serious. She asked me if I had any idea what this would do to our family's reputation. Reputation. That was the word she used. Not "how is the child?" Not "are you okay?" Reputation. I tried to keep going. I told her about Lily, about the letter, about how she had no one else. Rachel let out this long sigh, the kind that made you feel like you were wasting her time, and told me that plenty of kids are in foster care and that it wasn't my job to save every one of them. She said I was being impulsive, that I was letting my emotions run the show because of the IVF failures, and that I needed to think about Daniel. When I told her Daniel had already left, the line went quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "And I'll never forget this," she said. "Well, can you blame him?" That one hit me right in the chest. I hung up without saying goodbye. 2 hours later, I called my mom. Patricia Carter was 62 years old, a retired school librarian who spent her days gardening and watching cooking shows. She was the kind of mother who always kept the peace, who smoothed things over, who never raised her voice because conflict made her uncomfortable. When I told her about Lily, she listened quietly. She didn't interrupt like Rachel. She let me talk. And when I was done, she took a long breath and said she didn't know what to say. She told me it was a lot to take in. She asked me if I was sure about this, if I'd really thought it through. I told her I had. I told her I couldn't walk away from this child. Mom was quiet for another long moment, and then she said something that felt like a door closing. She told me she supported me as her daughter, but she didn't know if she could accept this situation. She said she needed time. She said the family needed time. And by the family, I knew she meant Rachel, because Rachel was the one who set the tone for everything in our house. If Rachel disapproved, everyone disapproved. That's just how it worked. My dad was a different story. Robert Carter was 65, a retired electrician who said about 10 words a day on a good day. He wasn't cold exactly, just quiet. The kind of man who showed love by fixing your car or building a shelf, not by talking about feelings. When Mom told him about Lily, his only response was apparently a long pause followed by, "Well, that's something." That was it. No opinion, no judgment, no support either. Just silence. Classic dad. Over the next few weeks, the family's position became clear, without anyone saying it directly. Rachel was openly hostile. She made comments to our mom about how I was throwing my life away and how Daniel was smart to leave. Mom relayed these comments to me in that careful, diplomatic way of hers, always prefacing them with, "Now, Rachel doesn't mean it like that, but..." Dad said nothing, but his silence said everything. Then, about 3 weeks before Christmas, Mom called and invited me to the family dinner. She said it in this overly cheerful voice, like she was trying to paste a smile over a crack in the wall. She told me everyone would love to see me, and after a pause that lasted just a beat too long, she added that I could bring the girl if I wanted. The girl. Not Lily. Not your daughter. The girl. I should have known that invitation wasn't peace. It was a setup. She apologized every time she ate, like being hungry was a mistake. That's the thing about Lily that broke me the most in those first few weeks. Not the nightmares, though those were terrible. Not the flinching every time I raised my hand to brush hair out of her face. Not even the way she'd freeze in the doorway of a room, waiting for permission to enter like she was a guest in a hotel instead of a child in her own home. It was the apologies. She apologized for everything. Sorry for using too much soap in the bath. Sorry for leaving the light on. Sorry for dropping a spoon on the kitchen floor. And every single time she sat down to eat, before she even picked up her fork, she'd look at me with those big brown eyes and whisper, "Sorry." The first time it happened, I didn't understand. I put a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her on a Saturday morning, and she just sat there, hands in her lap, staring at the food like it might disappear. I told her to go ahead and eat. She looked up at me, her lips barely moving, and said, "Sorry for being hungry." I had to turn around and face the sink so she wouldn't see me cry. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white, and I just stood there, hot tears running down my face, biting the inside of my cheek to keep quiet. Because what kind of life does a child have to live to believe that hunger is something you should apologize for? The nightmares came every night for the first 3 weeks. She'd wake up screaming, sometimes in words, sometimes just sounds, raw and animal and terrifying. I'd run to her room and find her sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat, clutching that one-eyed bear so tight her little fingers were white. She never told me what the dreams were about. I never pushed her to. I'd just sit on the edge of her bed, not touching her because she didn't like being touched yet, and talk to her in a low, calm voice until her breathing slowed down. Some nights it took 5 minutes. Some nights it took an hour. Some nights I fell asleep right there on her floor, curled up on the carpet like a guard dog that refused to leave its post. Slowly, painfully slowly, things started to shift. The first breakthrough came about 2 weeks in. I was sitting on the couch reading after Lily had gone to bed, and I heard soft footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the living room doorway in her pajamas, the bear hanging from one hand, her eyes puffy from crying. She stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just looking at me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just waited. Then she walked over, climbed up on the couch next to me, and leaned her head against my arm. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. We just sat there, the two of us, in the quiet of that empty house, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself be close to someone without flinching. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, afraid that any movement would spook her like a frightened animal. Tears rolled down my cheeks, but I didn't wipe them. I just let them fall. After that night, the progress came in small, fragile steps. She started eating without apologizing, though she still ate fast, like someone might take the food away. She stopped freezing in doorways, though she still moved through the house quietly, like she was trying not to take up space. She let me brush her hair. She let me hold her hand when we crossed the street. She even laughed once, a real laugh, when I accidentally burnt pancakes so badly the smoke alarm went off and I ran around the kitchen, waving a dish towel at the ceiling like a maniac. That laugh was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Then, one evening, about 6 weeks after she came to live with me, everything changed. I was tucking her into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin the way she liked it, making sure the bear was positioned just right beside her. I leaned down and whispered, "Good night." I turned to leave, and when I reached the doorway, I heard her voice behind me, small and trembling but clear. She said, "Good night, Mom." I stopped walking. My hand gripped the doorframe. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned around slowly, and she was looking at me with those big brown eyes, wide open, terrified, like she'd just said something forbidden and was bracing herself for the consequences. I walked back to her bed, knelt down beside her, and took her small hand in both of mine. I told her she could call me that whenever she wanted. A tear slid down her cheek, then another. Then she leaned forward and wrapped her thin arms around my neck, and I held her. This fragile little person who had been through more pain in 7 years than most people face in a lifetime. And I cried into her hair while she cried into my shoulder. And in that moment, I became her mother. Not on paper, not by DNA, but in every way that actually matters. From that night on, Lily called me Mom. And every time she said it, it felt like a gift I didn't deserve, but would spend the rest of my life trying to earn. By the time Christmas came, I thought we were ready. I was wrong. Mom, will your family like me? Lily asked that question from the backseat of my car as we drove through the rain toward my parents' house on Christmas Eve. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was wearing the red dress I bought her the week before, the one she picked out herself at Target, spinning in front of the fitting room mirror with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. Now that smile was gone. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the stuffed bear wedged between her leg and the car door, her eyes scanning the dark road ahead like she was heading towards something dangerous. I swallowed hard and forced a smile into my voice. I told her of course they'd like her, that they were excited to meet her. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. I hadn't spoken to Rachel in 3 weeks. My last conversation with Mom had been short and awkward, full of long pauses and careful words that said nothing. And Daniel, who I'd secretly hoped might show up as some kind of Christmas miracle, had texted me 2 days earlier saying he'd be spending the holidays with his brother in Portland. So it was just me and Lily, driving through the rain on a dark highway, heading toward a house full of people who didn't want her there. The drive from Seattle to my parents' place in Bellevue took about 30 minutes, but that night it felt like hours. Lily was quiet for most of it, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different about her silence. It wasn't the empty, detached quiet I'd gotten used to in the early days. This was tense, alert, like she was preparing herself for something she'd been through before. About 10 minutes from my parents' house, she spoke again. She asked me in a small, careful voice what she should do if somebody didn't like her. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I looked at her in the rearview mirror again, this 7-year-old girl in a red dress and secondhand shoes, asking me for instructions on how to survive rejection from people she'd never even met. I told her that if anyone was mean to her, we'd leave. Simple as that. She nodded slowly, like she was storing that promise somewhere safe in case she needed it later. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the way it always did at Christmas. White lights wrapped around the porch railing, a wreath on the front door, the warm yellow glow of the living room spilling through the windows into the dark, wet night. Through the glass, I could see the Christmas tree, tall and perfectly decorated, and shadows moving inside, people laughing, holding drinks, living their comfortable lives. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. Lily was staring at the house through the passenger window, her breath fogging up the glass. She pressed one small hand against the window, fingers spread wide, like she was trying to touch the warmth on the other side. Without looking at me, she whispered that it was really pretty. Something about the way she said it, so quiet, so full of longing, made my eyes sting. This child had probably never had a real Christmas. No tree, no presents, no family gathered around a table. And here she was, staring at this house like it was something out of a fairy tale, not knowing that the people inside had already decided she didn't deserve to be part of it. I got out of the car, walked around to her side, and opened the door. She looked up at me, clutching her bear against her chest. I reached out my hand and told her we were going to do this together. She took my hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. We walked up the path to the front door, the rain misting around us, Christmas lights reflecting in the puddles at our feet. I could hear laughter inside. I could smell roasted turkey and cinnamon. I squeezed Lily's hand and rang the doorbell. The moment we stepped inside, I knew this night would not end quietly. The room went silent the moment we walked through the door. Then my sister smiled, and everything broke. Mom greeted us first, hugging me quickly with stiff arms before looking down at Lily with a tight, uncomfortable smile. She said hello in that overly sweet voice adults use when they've already decided not to love a child. Lily pressed closer to my leg and whispered hi without looking up. Dad glanced at us from his recliner, gave me a nod, looked at Lily for 2 seconds, then turned back to the football game on mute. Rachel was standing by the fireplace with a glass of red wine, posing like she owned the room. When she saw us, she smiled, but it wasn't a real smile. She said it was so nice I could make it. She didn't acknowledge Lily at all. Not a hello. Not a wave. Nothing. Dinner started an hour later. Mom had gone all out like she always did. Turkey, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, the good china, candles lit, Christmas music playing softly. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt wrong. I sat Lily next to me. She looked so small in that big wooden chair, her feet dangling, her eyes scanning the room like a scared animal mapping the exits. For the first 20 minutes, things were almost bearable. Dad carved the turkey. Mom talked about her garden. Greg told some boring story about real estate. Rachel laughed too loudly at everything he said. And Lily sat beside me, eating tiny bites, making no sound, disappearing into herself the way she'd learned to do in her old life. Then Rachel's daughter Olivia looked across the table and asked Lily where her real mom was. The table went quiet. Lily froze, put her fork down slowly, and said in a barely audible voice that her mom went to heaven. Before Olivia could ask another question, Rachel cut in with a cold, thin smile. She told Lily it must be really confusing, being in a stranger's house for Christmas. I told Rachel she wasn't in a stranger's house, that she was with me. Rachel took a sip of wine, casual and unbothered, and corrected me. She said, "Right. Her temporary guardian." Those words landed like a slap. Like the bond between me and Lily was nothing more than paperwork. Rachel kept going. She turned to Mom and started talking like I wasn't even there, saying she was concerned about this whole situation, that bringing an unknown child into the family without consulting anyone was irresponsible. She talked about Lily's background, her mother, what kind of environment she came from, using a tone that made my stomach turn. Like Lily was contaminated. Like poverty and pain were something you could catch. Mom sat there saying nothing. Dad chewed his turkey. Greg studied his wine glass. And Lily, my Lily, shrank into her chair like she was trying to fold herself into nothing. I told Rachel that was enough. My voice was shaking. Rachel swirled her wine, leaned back, and delivered the line that blew everything apart. She looked directly at Lily, not at me, at this 7-year-old child, and said, "Sweetie, I'm sure you're a nice girl. But this is a family dinner. And you're not family." The air left the room. Mom gasped. Dad's fork clinked against his plate. And Lily looked up at my sister with an expression that will haunt me forever. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was resigned. Like she'd heard this before. Like she'd been expecting it. In the smallest voice, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'll wait outside." Something inside me broke wide open. Not sadness. Rage. Pure white-hot rage that ripped through my entire body. I stood up so fast my chair hit the wall. I slammed both hands on the table and told Rachel she would not speak to my daughter like that. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She told me Lily wasn't my daughter, that she was a stranger's kid I picked up from a government office. Mom tried to calm everyone down, but I was past calming down. I told them I was done. Done pretending this family was something it wasn't. Done watching them treat a child like she was trash. Rachel stood up, pointed at me, and said I'd lost my mind, that I blew up my marriage and embarrassed the family for a kid who wasn't even mine. The room erupted. Mom was crying. Dad was telling everyone to sit down. Greg was pulling Rachel's arm. I was standing there, chest heaving, tears streaming down my face, hands shaking. Then, in the middle of all that chaos, I turned around to reach for Lily. But Lily was gone. She was standing outside in the cold, waiting for me, like I might leave her. I found her on the front porch, tucked into the corner beside the rocking chair, her arms wrapped around her bear, her red dress soaked from the rain that was blowing sideways under the porch roof. She wasn't crying. She was just standing there, perfectly still, staring out at the dark street like she was already planning where she'd go next. Like she'd done this before. Like she knew how this story always ended. When she heard the front door open, she flinched. Then she saw it was me, and her whole body relaxed just slightly, like a rope that had been pulled too tight, loosening by one single thread. I knelt down in front of her, the rain soaking through my jeans, the cold biting into my skin. I didn't care. I reached out and gently took her hands. They were freezing. She looked at me with those big brown eyes, wide and terrified, and asked me a question that shattered every last wall I had left. She asked me if I was going to send her back. My throat closed up. My vision blurred. I pulled her into my arms and held her so tight I could feel her tiny heartbeat against my chest, fast and scared like a bird trapped in a cage. I told her no. I told her I was never sending her back. I told her she was mine and I was hers, and nothing anybody said in that house or anywhere else would ever change that. She buried her face into my neck, her small body shaking, and for the first time since I'd known her, she cried. Not the silent tears I'd seen before. Real crying. Deep, broken sobs that came from somewhere so far inside her that I don't think even she knew that place existed. I held her on that porch in the rain, rocking her gently, whispering into her hair that she was safe, that I was here, that I wasn't going anywhere. Behind me, I heard the front door open. I didn't turn around. I already knew who it was. My mom's voice came out shaky and small. She said my name and asked me to come back inside, said we could talk about this. I stood up slowly, lifting Lily with me. She wrapped her legs around my waist and her arms around my neck, holding on like I was the only solid thing in her world. I turned around and looked at my mother standing in the doorway, the warm light of the house spilling out behind her, the sound of Rachel's voice still going inside. I told my mom that there was nothing to talk about. I told her that her granddaughter just apologized for existing, and nobody at that table said a word. Mom's face crumbled. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't wait for her to find the words. I walked down the porch steps into the rain, carrying Lily against my chest, and headed toward my car. Behind me, I heard my dad's voice for the first time all night. He called my name from the doorway. I stopped, but didn't turn around. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Drive safe, sweetheart." That was it. 2 words of love wrapped inside a lifetime of silence. I strapped Lily into the back seat. She was still holding onto my hand, not wanting to let go. I told her we were going home. She looked at me, her face wet with rain and tears, and whispered, "Okay." I got behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled out of that driveway. In the rearview mirror, I could see my parents' house getting smaller, the Christmas lights blurring through the rain on the back window. Lily fell asleep before we hit the highway, her bear pressed against her cheek, her breathing finally slow and steady. I drove through the dark, both hands gripping the wheel, tears rolling silently down my face. I had just walked away from my family, from my mother, from the house I grew up in, from every holiday, every memory, every version of myself that belonged to them. And sitting in the back seat, soaked and exhausted and finally at peace, was the reason why. 5 days later, something unexpected happened. 6 months have passed since that Christmas night, and my life looks nothing like it used to. 5 days after I walked out of my parents' house, there was a knock on my door. It was early morning. Lily was eating cereal at the kitchen table, and I was on my second cup of coffee, running on barely any sleep. When I opened the door, Daniel was standing on the porch. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, wearing the same jacket he'd left in. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking past me into the house where Lily was sitting at the table, watching us with wide, cautious eyes. Then he looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper, and said he was sorry. He told me he'd been staying at his brother's place, thinking about everything, replaying it all in his head. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, that he still didn't know if he ever would be. But he said he couldn't keep being the kind of man who walks away from someone he loves, because things got hard. I didn't invite him in right away. I stood in that doorway for a long time, searching his face for something real, something I could trust. He didn't push, he just waited. It was Lily who broke the silence. She slid off her chair, walked to the door, looked up at Daniel, and asked him if he wanted some cereal. Something shifted in his face. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a movie moment. Just a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. He looked down at this little girl, offering him breakfast like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he nodded. He said, yeah, he'd like that. That was 6 months ago. Daniel moved back in, but things aren't perfect. We're in counseling. Some days are good. Some days the silence comes back and fills the rooms like smoke. He's trying. I can see it. But trust, once broken, takes a long time to rebuild. My mom called about a month after Christmas. She cried on the phone for 10 minutes before she could even speak. She said she was ashamed of herself, that she should have stood up for Lily at that table, that she let Rachel run the family for too long. She asked if she could meet Lily properly. I told her she could, but on my terms. She agreed. She's been coming by every other weekend since then, and I can see her falling in love with Lily slowly, carefully, the way you approach something precious that you're afraid you might break. Rachel hasn't called. Not once. I heard through Mom that she thinks I overreacted, that I tore the family apart over someone else's kid. I don't waste energy on her anymore. Maybe one day she'll come around. Maybe she won't. Either way, Lily is not negotiable. Dad showed up unannounced one Saturday with a wooden bookshelf he'd built by hand. He carried it into Lily's room without a word, set it up in the corner, and put her bare on the top shelf. Then he looked at Lily and said, "Every girl needs a place for her books." Lily smiled at him, and I saw my father's eyes get glassy for the first time in my entire life. As for Lily, she's doing better. She started 2nd grade last month. She made a friend named Sophie. She still has nightmares sometimes, but they're less frequent now. She doesn't apologize for eating anymore. She laughs more. She runs through the house instead of tiptoeing. And every night, without fail, she says, "Good night, Mom," and every single time, it fills something inside me that I didn't even know was empty. I won't pretend this story has a perfect ending, because it doesn't. Life isn't like that. But here's what I've learned. Family isn't defined by blood. It isn't defined by last names or DNA tests or who sits at the Christmas table. Family is defined by who shows up when everything falls apart. Family is defined by who stays. So let me ask you this. If a child needed you, truly needed you, and choosing her meant losing everything you knew, would you do it? Would you choose her? I did. And I'd do it again. Every single time.